Okay, in this video I want to talk about fiscal policy, which is going to be the main theme of Unit 5, where we're going to be covering fiscal policy, its limitations, the crowding out effect, as well as its effect on the federal debt, as well as any budget deficits or surpluses. So just to quickly begin, fiscal policy is going to be the government levels of government spending and then the levels of taxes. So it's going to be made up of two things: taxes and government spending. So with that, there's no mention of money supply here. There's no mention of the Fed. So this is all going to be decided by politicians, by Congress, by the president. So the Fed and money supply is not going to be included here. That is all going to be monetary policy, which we've already covered, not included. So if you see any quiz questions or any test questions that involve money supply or changing of the money supply or any Federal Reserve Bank decisions, none of that is going to be considered fiscal policy. There's two other things that are going to be really important with this unit, and that's going to be any budget surpluses or deficits, and we spend a whole day on this later on in the unit. A budget surplus, and this is, again, I'm talking about the federal budget, or if we're talking about some economy, that economy's government's budget or budget deficit or budget surplus. The surplus is going to be a situation where the tax revenue is going to be greater than the government spending. And so we have more money that we're bringing in than we're spending, than we're leaving out. So we end up with more money than what we began with. That's going to be a budget surplus. A budget deficit is going to be the opposite, where the amount of taxes is going to be less than the government spending. Currently, with our federal government, we often have a budget deficit where we are spending more than what we're bringing in tax revenue. Expansionary fiscal policy is actually going to lead to a deficit. And so what's going to happen with expansionary fiscal policy is either we're going to lower taxes or we can increase government spending, or of course you can do both. And that's something that we're actually doing right now in 2017 and then into 2018. That has occurred over these last few months. This is going to increase aggregate demand, and I really want to highlight this part. You're going to have a rightward shift in aggregate demand here, and of course this is going to lead to a budget deficit. So if you see a question that says something along the lines of the government has a budget deficit, you can then take that to mean that there's been expansionary fiscal policy occurring. I also quickly want to talk about how this expansionary fiscal policy can work. So I'll start with taxes. So if I have, let's say, a decrease in taxes, so if my taxes are falling, that means that my disposable personal income, which I'm going to call DPI, that's going to increase. And so just a reminder, disposable personal income is going to be your amount of income or your wealth after taxes. So if the taxes are falling, that means that you have more money. And with an increase in wealth or an increase in income, you know that consumption spending can increase, and then aggregate demand will increase. And just a reminder, aggregate demand is going to be consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And so if consumption is increasing, so will aggregate demand. At the same time, if we have a decrease in government spending, let me back up. If we have an increase in government spending, that's what I'd like to do here. If I have an increase in government spending, then it's far more direct. If G is going up, so is aggregate demand. So if government spending goes up, aggregate demand will as well. Now there's one really important thing that we need to talk about before we go too far. If we have expansionary fiscal policy, the government is going to need to pay for this. If we have an increase in government spending, the government needs that money in order to write those checks, in order to buy those new goods and services. If it's aircraft carriers and submarines and missiles or missile defense, or if it's roads and bridges and pipes or tunnels, whatever it ends up being, the government's going to need that money. So they're going to need to finance it. And you might see that phrase where they have to finance, or you might see the phrase deficit spend. These are going to be really important. The way that the government finances this, or the way the government spends it or gets the money for this, is by selling bonds. And that's going to be super important here. They're going to pay for this by selling bonds. And I want to add that in. You pay for expansionary fiscal policy by selling bonds. And that will That will tie into something that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes with crowding out and the crowding out effect. That's going to be a big theme of this unit. Contractionary fiscal policy is going to be the exact opposite. That's where we have higher taxes, decreased government spending, or a combination of both of those. It's going to decrease aggregate demand. So we would use this in a period of high inflation or inflationary concern. And it's going to lead to a budget surplus where we've got more money now than we had at the beginning of the year. I'll also talk about how this can work. If we increase taxes, that means the disposable personal income, our money after tax, is going to decrease. With a decrease in our income or a decrease in our wealth, consumption spending will fall, and then aggregate demand can fall as well. At the same time, if government spending decreases, then aggregate demand will decrease as well. Because remember, aggregate demand is going to be consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. One of the first things that we're going to cover in this unit are going to be stabilizers. Stabilizers are going to be something that will either work to correct a recession or work to correct any inflationary issues that we have. Most of the good examples are going to be programs that are enacted when we have a recession. So I'll start with those. Any automatic stabilizers where these will kick in by themselves automatically might be unemployment benefits, where if we lose our job, we can get benefits that will help us pay the bills. And when we're paying the bills, that means that we're spending. So that can keep consumption high even if people are losing their jobs. And so that's one thing that might help fight against a recession. At the same time, food stamps can do the same thing, where if people are losing income because they've lost their jobs, they can still buy food with food stamps. So that's one other program that might help fight a recession. At the same time, tax brackets, where if we're making more money because the economy is growing, we end up paying more in taxes. So that's going to be on the other side that might help fight inflation. So those would be examples of automatic stabilizers where there's no direct policy change or political action that's taken place. One hint, if you see this phrase, as a result, this often will lead to an automatic stabilizer where as a result of people losing their jobs, unemployment benefits have increased and consumption spending has not fallen by as much. That might be an example of an automatic stabilizer where they use that phrase, as a result. Discretionary stabilizers are going to be when there's a specific action that Congress has taken or government has taken in terms of a policy change. Recently, there's been a complete overhaul of our tax structure and our tax rates, modeled as tax cuts by some people. That might be that might be an example of a discretionary stabilizer. Also, any changes to spending bills, which we've recently passed, might be examples of discretionary stabilizers. The main way that aggregate demand can be changed, especially if it's going to be with expansionary policy, will be through the Keynesian multiplier effect, or you might see this as a spending multiplier as well. And just to recap, that's going to be any additional shift in aggregate demand because money can get spent and then respent by somebody else and then respent by somebody else and then respent by somebody else. And so that's going to be because there's repeated consumer spending. So even if this is with an initial increase in government spending, again, that money can get spent and respent and respent. So that's the main reason that aggregate demand can increase. However, there is one thing to note. Aggregate demand can also decrease when we have expansionary policy, and that's due to this crowding out effect. And now the weight of these two, the crowding out effect versus the Keynesian multiplier, is going to be a little bit unclear. We would need specific numbers here in order to find out the actual net effect. But it is super important to know that any change in government spending will lead to, and we'll focus on this soon, will lead to an increase in interest rates. And when interest rates are increasing, private investment is going to be falling. And so that's the part that's really important here. So we can have an increase in government spending, but then a decrease in investment. So then we're not entirely sure what's happened to aggregate demand. So that's going to be really important. So aggregate demand, we don't know because consumption might have increased, let's say, but investment has fallen when government spending has increased. So because we're not sure what the effect is going to be, aggregate demand at the least will not be increasing by as much, and that's going to be really important. The reason why, again, is because the government needs to pay for its increase in spending, and they do that by selling bonds, and that's going to be really important here. So expansionary fiscal policy can lead to crowding out, and any time that we're selling bonds, you will have this situation, but it is mainly due to expansionary fiscal policy. And that ties into some of these other issues that we have with fiscal policy, including time lags. There's conflicts because we're talking about politics here. The fact that it doesn't really address stagflation. And then the last one is going to be the net export effect, which I'm going to explain in a minute. But first, time lags are going to be the chief issue or the chief limitation of fiscal policy. We first need to recognize what the issue is in the economy. Is there a recession? Is there inflation? Are we out of a recession or not? These are all questions that are really hard to answer and hard to identify. We then need to figure out what we're going to do in order to solve this problem. That's going to be the administrative lag. And the last thing is we need this fix that we've just enacted. We need it to take place and to start working and to start fixing the problem. That's going to be the operational lag. So we've got these three things. Now, by the time that we get all of this figured out, implemented, and working, we might not have that problem anymore. The recession might be over when we finally have these anti-recession measures out in the economy working. Then we can have inflation, or vice versa. And so this is going to be a real challenge. It takes a really long time for these policies to take place and to start working. The next one's going to be conflict with politics, and I think this makes a lot of sense. Contractionary fiscal policy is very unpopular, and so politicians don't often pursue this, and that's a really big problem. The next one, again, is fairly straightforward. We can't directly fix stagflation with these policies. Stagflation is going to be a decrease in short and aggregate supply, but what I've talked about, at least today, is going to be addressing aggregate demand. So we can't fix both of these problems at the same time. We just talked about the crowding out effect, and that's going to be the fact that with increased interest rates, the change in aggregate demand is not going to be as great as it could be. And the last one's a little bit complicated, especially because we haven't covered international trade and foreign exchange markets yet. But the net export effect is going to be where we have those increased interest rates, so then foreigners might want to invest their money in our country, meaning they might want to buy our bonds, put their money in our banks because we pay a higher interest rate. But they first need US dollars first, and that leads to a strong dollar, which then will lead to a decrease in exports. Because with a strong dollar, our stuff is more expensive, so foreigners won't want to buy our stuff as much. So when exports fall, aggregate demand can fall as well, and that's going to be another limiter to fiscal policy. One last thing, if people decide to save their money and the multiplier is not going to be as high, let's say if the marginal propensity to consume falls because people are saving more of their money, that is not a limiter that is not going to be a limiter to fiscal policy and its effectiveness. So keep that in mind. That's going to be really important. A lot of people have made that mistake in the past.